Nathaniel and Ruth were so excited. They'd been waiting years for this moment in time. They hoped and they prayed. They'd asked God on many an occasion. And now the pains were beginning. Ruth knew that the baby that was inside her was about to be born. Nathaniel did what every good Jewish husband did at that moment in time, and he hung around outside. As the midwife gathered with a couple of female friends, Ruth gave birth. She gave birth to a little baby boy. They'd already decided that his name was going to be Zachariah. It was a good name. It was a name that any Jewish mum and dad would be proud to give their baby. And so the birthday came and the birthday went. And 2 years later, Zachariah was still lying in his tiny bed. And the great hope that they had had seemed to fade with every month that passed, because the only part of his body that seemed to move was his head. And birthdays came, and birthdays went, and Nathaniel and Ruth grew old and died. And Zachariah also grew, but the only part of him that moved in celebration on the day of his birth was his head. And birthdays came, and birthdays went. And every day a few friends would bring food to Zechariah. He would express his thanks to them. But he could never hug them, nor go anywhere with them. For the only part of his body that moved was his head. Then one day, those friends came to Zechariah with some exciting news. There was a preacher healer in town. Perhaps this could be the day that it all changed. And Zechariah did what only he could do. He turned his head, but nothing else moved. And he said, "Can you get me to him?" Zechariah's world was exactly 6 foot by 2 foot wide. That had been his world now for many years. His mat was his home was his world. Everything that he knew and heard and did happened in a world space exactly 6 foot by 2 foot. If it didn't happen on the mat for Zechariah, it didn't happen. Whatever it was. His worldview never changed. wherever his 6 foot by 2 foot mat was, that was his world. And now something stirred in a part of him that had never moved. It stirred within his spirit. If I could get to the healer, life could change. But his world was 6 foot by 2 foot, and nothing could change that. Until the friends who came on a daily basis to feed him, quite frankly, to clean him up, to spend a few hours, maybe, on a good day, talking with him, suggested, we could take you. And so grabbing the corner of his 6 foot by 2 foot world, they walked across the village. Zachariah had rarely seen his village because his world, after all, was 6 foot by 2 foot. He saw things that day that he had rarely seen. He was going to a house that he'd never been into. And something started to stir inside of his life on his 6 foot by 2 foot world. The possibility that life could change. When he got to the house with his friends, the house was already full. It wasn't a very big house. None of their houses were. But there were at least 30 or 40 people crowded inside the house, and a dozen or so more outside of the house. So when he arrived on his 6 foot by 2 foot world, he was already excluded from the possibility of the hope that had been raised within him. But what he didn't know, and what the crowd in the house didn't know, was that those that were carrying his 6 foot by 2 foot world already had a plan. They weren't going through the crowd, they were going over them. And so at the outside steps leading to the flat roof of this small home, his friends lifted his 6 foot by 2 foot world onto the roof of some unknown person's home. They laid his world upon the roof and decided at that moment in time that this man's life and this man's future was not only worth the physical effort of lifting him to the roof, but the physical effort that was now going to be needed to put him into the presence of the one who could change his world. And they ripped the tiles, the wooden structure of the roof, the straw, anything that was in the way, they ripped it apart. They didn't seem to give a thought to the fact that it wasn't their home or their roof, or in fact their right. All they were interested in was a friend whose world was 6 foot by 2 foot. Having dug a hole, made a mess, and covered those below with the dust and the debris of the roof deconstruction. They found a few bits of rope in the corner of the roof, tying them to the corner of his 6 foot by 2 foot world. They lowered him into the presence of Jesus. Everyone was surprised about his arrival. As they dusted the debris off of their hair and from around their clothing. Some were surprised, but some were critical. What's he doing here? The Messiah, the rabbi, the teacher, the healer, he's not for the likes of him. After all, he's on his 6 foot by 2 foot world because of his sin. Or maybe the sin of his parents. Or maybe the sin of his grandparents, or great-grandparents, or great-great-grandparents. We don't care, but what we do know is he's on that mat because of sin. Of course, none of them were brave enough to say that out loud. But in the crowded environment of that home, they thought it loud enough. What they didn't know was that they were in the presence of a God who knows every thought, every murmuring of the human heart. And Jesus stopped what he was doing. And he looked up at those who had these thoughts. And he asked them a simple question. You see, Jesus had just declared something in their presence that demanded that, according to their law at least, he should be taken outside, buried up to the neck with his head exposed, and then they would pick up rocks and throw them just at his defenseless head, because that's how they dealt with people who blasphemed. You see, he had said some simple words. Looking at the man on his 6 foot by 2 foot world, he said, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Which was really strange, because the man hadn't asked for anything. And probably in his 6 foot by 2 foot world, the last thing he was thinking about was the possibility of his sins being forgiven. And then Jesus looked at those who had the critical thought. Strangely enough, they looked just like you, or you, or you, or you, or me. And he asked a question. Is it easier to forgive someone's sins or to heal them? The story does not record their thoughts at that moment, but I would venture a guess that the thoughts were, I haven't got a clue. I've no idea. What's the right answer? No one ever taught us the right answer to that question. Should I say something out loud? Should I just keep thinking? At that moment in time, Jesus said, just to show you the authority that I have, I will say to this man, son, pick up your mat and get out of here. In an instant, a 6 foot by 2 foot world became 1,000 miles by 1,000 miles, became eternity by eternity, became possibility by possibility, because all of the restriction that his world had was removed in an instant by the one who not only healed him, but told him he was made whole inside as well as outside. They didn't take Jesus outside and dig a hole and bury him until his head was showing, and then pick up rocks and throw them at him until he was dead. Because strangely enough, in that moment, their world also expanded. See, this man was locked into a 6 foot by 2 foot world, but they were locked into a sphere that just about encompassed their heads. They could think no further than the thoughts they had. They could imagine no further than the imaginations that they'd had. They could comprehend no further than what had already gone into the space of their heads. But at that moment in time, in that indescribable point when eternity seemed to touch a 6 foot by 2 foot space, not only was this man's life expanded beyond the boundary lines that had been laid out by those who had laid out his mat, but theirs had also expanded, because if what he had just said was true, that he had the power to heal, and only God has the power to heal, and he had forgiven, and only God can forgive, then suddenly they recognized they were stood not in the presence of a great teacher or rabbi or even wandering minstrel or singer or superstar or come by day, come by night healer. They were stood in the presence of God himself. And it isn't recorded what happened within the sphere of their heads that day. But the man whose world had been 6 foot by 2 foot went and told 100,000 people of a God who loved him so much. He wanted to take him from the restrictions of his world and transport him into the possibilities of something far bigger, far greater, far more immense than he could have ever hoped or dreamed when he woke up that morning. And although the good book does not record it, I personally am convinced that Zachariah found a new world. And that world involved following the one who took him from 6 foot by 2 foot world into a kingdom that no man can contain, into the possibility that no thought could ever reach, into a relationship that he'd never dreamed possible with the authority of all life. Of course, that story isn't true. Well, part of it is. I don't know whether Nathaniel or Ruth ever had a child. In fact, I don't even know whether there was a Nathaniel or a Ruth. And I don't know whether the man was called Zachariah or not. But what I learned as I reflected on that story this week were a number of things. Many of us live in a 6 foot by 2 foot world. Oh, we might be able to move around, but we still live in a 6 foot by 2 foot world. You see, our thinking is no greater than the space in which we stand, and our thinking is about the great I am in our life, which is the great I. And our thinking isn't about what lies beyond this life or this frame. It's fairly self-centered. It's about the me in my life. And many of us can live in the prison of the me of our own lives. The other thing I learned as I pondered on that story this week was that there comes a time very often in my 6 foot by 2 foot world where I can't get beyond it, even if I am able-bodied. Sometimes it requires a friend to take me into the presence of Jesus. Sometimes it requires someone to bring some good news into my 6 foot by 2 foot world and then provide a means for me getting from my bit of that world into a new world and a new place and a new thought and a new hope in the very presence of Jesus. My world often needs to be blown apart, because my thinking at times can be so small. I'd like to tell you the very spiritual way is for us to make a decision to walk into the presence of Jesus, but clearly that wasn't an option for, let's call him, Zachariah. And because it wasn't an option, what he needed was what I have discovered I need in my life more often than I care to admit. And that is a bunch of good friends around me who will tell me there is a possibility beyond the boundary lines of my life. Not only tell me that there is a possibility, but make the way possible by carrying me into the presence of one who can expand the very horizons of my life. And I also need friends who are not going to be put off by the fact that the crowd is already around Jesus, because let's face it, the crowd's always around Jesus. And there's a possibility of a thought that can go into our minds if we live in our 6 foot by 2 foot world that Jesus is already too busy. He doesn't really want to see me either. After all, what have I ever contributed to the world? Or, come to that, what have I ever contributed to the church? What have I ever contributed to anything? I've only ever lived in my 6 foot by 2 foot world. Sometimes it takes a friend to say, if you meet with Jesus, your world can change. Sometimes it takes a friend to bash through the boundary lines of life and the physical barriers of faith, the emotional barriers of faith, the mental barriers of faith on our behalf in order to introduce us to the possibility that Jesus can do something for us. Sometimes it takes a mate to take us to our healing. Oh, but surely it's by faith that we come. Not if you've lived in a 6 foot by 2 foot world all of your life. Because there isn't a whole lot of faith in the 6 foot by 2 foot world. Your food comes, your body gets cleaned, you get some sleep, you wake up, your food comes, your body gets cleaned, you get some sleep, you wake up, your body gets cleaned, you get some food, you wake up, and so it continues for day after day. And we might say, well, we're not living in a 6 foot by 2 foot world, but how many of us are living in the 6 foot by 2 foot mentality of life? God put into my spirit very strongly earlier this week. There are lots of people, including people of faith, who need a breakthrough in their lives. Because so often we restrict even our faith to a 6 foot by 2 foot space. And sometimes it takes someone who has seen a little bit more, and someone who's gone a little bit further than us, someone who knows a little bit more, someone who hopes maybe a little bit more than we do, because they've got beyond 6 foot by 2 foot and they've got into something called the kingdom. And I'm so glad there have been people in my life that have taken me beyond the confines of my life and taken me into the possibility of what an encounter with Jesus could mean. Can I say on that basis, the next time that we have a healing cafe, could we stop being selfish and invite someone who is living inside a 6 foot by 2 foot space into the possibility of a healing? But what about us? What about my life? What about yours? How big is your thinking as far as Jesus is concerned? Here's the sort of thoughts that lock you into 6 foot by 2 foot. I believe God will heal all those people over there. All those of great faith. All those who are somehow under the special favour of God. I believe God will heal them. But in reality, God, you're not interested in my 6 foot by 2 foot space. It's all them over there. I believe in the gifts of the Holy Spirit for them, for the spiritual ones, for the ones who seem to have the holy voice, or for those that have the holy life, or those that seem to be so special within the church, for those who've been raised up and exalted, those that can sing, but not my 6 foot by 2 foot space. It's over there. I believe that you can bless people's lives, God. You can bless them and meet their needs. You can supply everything that their heart desires. You can take them and use them in ways that are incredible. Those ones over there. But in my 6 foot by 2 foot space, life will just go on as it always has done, day after day after day after day after day after day. And I have no expectation that things will change in my life. You see, we can all lock ourselves into that space. And if we're honest, all of us have. When we've seen the liberation of God working within a church meeting, when we've heard the praises of God's people, we still stay within our space, because after all, that's for them to do, and God doesn't really want to hear my voice or even see my hands raised or even anything as far as I'm concerned, because this is all about them. And we all require at least one friend to come and say, let me lift you up from where you are and carry you into the presence of the possibility of what Jesus can do. Let's pray. We're going to listen to a very noisy piece of music. That's not anything to do with about what's going on here. God is not afraid of noise. We're going to listen to a noisy piece of music because of the words of the noisy piece of music. Through him, all things are possible. Through him, I can do anything. This morning, I would like to put two challenges to us. One is to allow God to enter our 6 foot by 2 foot space. And the second one is to go to someone who might need you to take them from their 6 foot by 2 foot space into the presence of Jesus. In order to do that, you need to look around and not be very super spiritual and close your eyes. In order to do that, you'll need to look around and say, well, God, who here? Who should I go to? Who should I stand with? Who should I invite? Who should I say Jesus can deal with it? Well, I don't know. I'll let Jesus do that in you. I've never told a story while I've preached before like that. But I felt at about 5:45 this morning that I needed to tell you a story. Oh, P.S. There might be someone here who is still in their 6 foot by 2 foot space that simply needs to say, can someone come and help me? In which case, you'll have to reach beyond your 6 foot by 2 foot space by asking, reaching a hand out, grabbing hold of someone that's nearby, whatever. Because we're about to have a moment where, quite frankly, God could do anything. Because he can. And nothing is impossible for him.